Good day. Today is Thursday, 16th October 2025, and before I continue with my program, let me remind you again, if you've listened to this program and liked the program or that part of the program which you have listened to, then please do remember to tick the like button. Well, today a meeting is due to take place in Washington between President Trump of the United States and President Zelensky of Ukraine. Zelensky is bringing various senior officials with him, including his defense minister and other senior officials, including Umerov, the secretary of his National Defense and Security Council, and also, I believe, his foreign minister. And the assumption, the universal assumption, is that Zelensky is going to be discussing principally with the United States the provision of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. And I am going to make my own guess here, in fact, it's not a guess, my own clear opinion, which is that the decision to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine has already been made, and it was made several weeks ago, probably before the media started talking about this. And the reason why the United States, or to be more precise, President Trump, and the more hard line of his officials, people like Mike Waltz and General Kellogg, have latched on to the idea of supplying cruise missiles to Ukraine, Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, was explained fairly clearly in an article that I read in the American media yesterday. I believe it was in CNN. And that is that the United States has no leverage over Russia, and it has gradually come to understand that. And President Trump remains completely committed, as far as I can see, to the freeze of the conflict along the lines that General Kellogg has been suggesting, without making any substantive concessions to the Russians. He's been trying to push the Russians in that direction by threatening sanctions. He's unwilling to continue direct escalation with the Russians by continuing the Biden-era policy of simply delivering weapons to the Russians, to the Ukrainians, because that was something that would have gone against the promises he made to his electoral base. And of course, and beyond that, he's also worried that if he continues to send weapons on that kind of scale to the Ukrainians, this kind of scale that the Biden administration was doing, then he is also going to find that American weapon inventories, which have already become severely depleted, are going to become more depleted still. And beyond and above all of that, the other specific issue is that, as became clear some months ago, I believe it was in June, the United States is no longer in a position to go on supplying Patriot missile air defense interceptors to Ukraine, the primary weapon that the Ukrainians were demanding. And the reason was that the stockpiles of these weapons have become extremely severely depleted. The United States is very short of Patriot air defense missile interceptors, which it might need in the event of a standoff with China or a renewal of the conflict between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. And besides, as the Western media has now been telling us, and as the Ukrainians themselves have recently admitted, the actual effectiveness of Patriot missile interceptors in Ukraine is no more than 6%, that their ability to shoot down Russian ballistic missiles, not to mention hypersonic missiles, is extremely low. And all of this is happening even as Russia escalates, intensifies night after night its air and missile and drone offensive against Ukraine and starts hitting hard Ukrainian energy targets right across Ukraine, devastating the energy complex of Ukraine and its economy. So President Trump, anxious to bring the Russians to the negotiating table, to try to compel them to negotiate basically on his terms, something which he failed to do in Anchorage, has, and short of other weapons that he can supply, and pressed to do this by people like Kellogg and his former National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who is now the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Anyway, President Trump, some weeks ago, some months ago, made the decision that since he can't provide Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine, and since Patriot missile interceptors don't work, he will supply Ukraine with an offensive weapons capability, Tomahawk missiles instead, hoping that this will somehow redress the balance and finally give him leverage over the Russians. And I am going to say here that given that that decision was clearly made some weeks ago, and given the way that decision-making works in Washington, I personally doubt that there was anything that the Russians could have said, whatever warnings they gave about this. I doubt that there was anything that the Russians could have said which would have persuaded the United States to change its approach. In fact, I do go along with those who say that if the Russians had responded aggressively to the American decision to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, the effect would not have been to deter the Americans from supplying Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. On the contrary, it would have strengthened the hand of the hardliners, of people like Kellogg and Waltz, and they would have simply cited the strength of the Russian reaction to Trump as proof that the Russians are afraid of these Tomahawk cruise missiles. So that perhaps to some extent explains President Putin's own reticence about this issue, his unwillingness to engage in a war of words with President Trump over this whole matter. There is more to say about this, and there are some criticisms that can be made of Putin over the way that he has handled this matter. Some of these criticisms I lean towards myself. I will discuss that later in this program. But let me first of all discuss the Tomahawk cruise missiles, because this has been a topic which there's been a lot of confusion and muddle about, but about which I received, as I said, a cascade of information over the last couple of days, and about which I feel I have now come to some level of clarity. Firstly, I think the most important thing to say is that it seems that the only Tomahawk cruise missiles that carry nuclear warheads today are possibly those that equip U.S. nuclear-powered submarines. And even that is not completely certain. All Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from U.S. Navy warships carry conventional warheads. There are no nuclear warheads on Tomahawk cruise missiles operated by U.S. Navy surface warships. And it is only those types of Tomahawk cruise missiles that are going to be delivered to Ukraine. In fact, it is debatable whether there is even a type of warhead, nuclear warhead, in existence that can be simply installed in U.S. surface warship in Tomahawk missiles that are launched by U.S. surface warships. So, fears that the Russians might mistake these missiles for nuclear-armed cruise missiles probably don't exist. I say that because I must assume that the Russians are very, very well informed about the size and nature of the US nuclear arsenal, and probably know that for many reasons, many very complex technical reasons, Tomahawk cruise missiles launched by submarines will not be supplied to Ukraine. They cannot be. And that the only Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be supplied to Ukraine for technical reasons come without nuclear warheads. So apprehensions that this could start a nuclear exchange seems extremely wild and probably unlikely. Now, there is an unresolved question about the launcher system. It's been suggested, some are still saying that the Typhoon system will be the system that will have to be sent to Ukraine. It is the only land-based system, launch system, in existence at the present time. For various reasons that I have discussed, I think it is inconceivable that a system of this size and complexity will be deployed in Ukraine. It will be an easy target for the Russians, and I don't think this possibility actually exists. It is more likely that the United States is going to try to revive the simpler system that was being developed for the US Marine Corps, but which was abandoned earlier this year. Now, I don't know how advanced that program was, and I've seen reports that it ran into difficulties. So it may take some time for that system to be brought back, or to be brought to a point where it can be effectively delivered to Ukraine. But, well, engineers can work on these things, and I am not going to get into discussions as to how this can be done. Now, I have also received very contradictory information about the number of these missiles that the United States has to spare. Some say, and I discussed this in my program yesterday, that the United States could supply at most 20 to 50. Others, and there's an article about this in the Financial Times, speculate that it could be several hundred. And that does seem to be a more plausible number. A piece of information I have received from a private source speculates that the number might be as high as 1,500. This source discounts the claims that the total number of Tomahawk cruise missiles in US service is just 4,000. He believes it is higher than this, between 7,000 and 8,000. He says that some of these missiles are being phased out because they're becoming old. He assumes that it will be these older missiles that will be supplied to Ukraine, and he thinks that there might be as many as 1,500 of these that could be sent to Ukraine. Of course, the number of missiles that can be sent to Ukraine will be connected to the number of launchers. If there's only 2 or 3 launchers, it might be difficult. It might not make much sense to send thousands of missiles at any one time to Ukraine. And to repeat again, the ground launchers that we've been talking about, the ones that the Marines were thinking of deploying, as far as I can tell, these never came into service, and it would take some time anyway to complete development of them, and it might take some time also to produce a sufficient quantity of them to supply them to Ukraine. So again, lots of uncertainties here. I am not going to speculate as to the viability of this plan or as to the numbers. I doubt that President Trump knows, and I doubt that President Zelensky cares, to be straightforward about this. I think the commitment to supply Tomahawk missiles is probably what they are going to decide and agree upon today, and it will probably take some time before these missiles appear. It may take well into 2026. Bear in mind that there were discussions and agreements in 2024, I believe, or it might even have been 2023, in the West to supply F-16 aircraft to Ukraine. It took well over a year for any of those aircraft to appear in Ukraine. They are currently apparently in Ukraine in very limited numbers, and they're achieving nothing because all of the many problems and complexities and difficulties of operating those F-16s that many people spoke about turned out to be real, and there was never really a proper response to them. So there are many uncertainties here, and I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the answers, but, well, one way or the other, the decision to supply the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine does look as if it is coming. Now, let us talk about the Russian reaction. Yesterday, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, made a long address discussing the various steps in the conflict and the overall situation with the conflict. And I have to say that overall, it seemed to me as if some kind of general understanding about how to approach this issue, the issue of the Tomahawks and other things, has been achieved between the various officials in Russia. And, well, this is what Lavrov said. I should explain, by the way, that this is an interview that Lavrov gave to the newspaper Kommersant. He was asked by Kommersant this question. Trump has... Well, first of all, I should explain that Lavrov said that the Russians met with Trump in Anchorage. There have been various proposals made in Anchorage. The Russians are waiting for the American response to the Russian proposals, and that there has been no reaction from the Americans or from the Ukrainians to the Russian proposals. And Kommersant responded, there has been a reaction. Trump is threatening to deploy Tomahawks. And Lavrov responded in this way. That is not a response to the concept discussed. None of his statements about Tomahawks have any bearing on what was discussed conceptually, indeed both conceptually and practically, in Alaska. He is under pressure. After Alaska, he went to consult, as he put it, with his allies. They flew there, bringing along Zelensky. They made no secret of their desire to lead Trump astray from his righteous path, as we say, to divert him from the course he himself charted through his political instincts. They're exploiting Trump's temperamental preference for swift decisions, deliberately protracting the process. And then he went on to say, when he returned to the topic of the Tomahawks. It is true that statements have been made about the Tomahawk missiles. But when President Trump spoke about the possibility of supplying these missiles, he also said that he did not want to escalate the war. In other words, he has admitted that sending the missiles could lead to a serious escalation. Ukraine would no longer have anything to do with it. This would cause colossal damage to the possibility of normalizing US-Russia relations and moving them out of deadlock. And so, essentially, it seems to me that for the moment, the signal that the Russians are giving to the US, to Trump, is that you're being led by the nose, by Zelensky and your European friends, and by the hardliners. We're not afraid of the Tomahawks, but we know how these weapons work. We know that they can only be operated by Americans. And by the way, there's been an article about this in the Financial Times. It depends entirely on American contractors to operate the Tomahawks. The Ukrainians by themselves cannot do it. American contractors is, of course, a euphemism for American military. They will simply leave the military and take out contracts with the military, and they will then work to operate these Tomahawk missiles. Anyway, if you do this, forget about Anchorage, forget about our discussions there. It's already bad that you haven't come back with a response to any of the proposals that we made. If you're going to let yourself be led by the nose in this way, then be under no doubt that there is no way forward, no further way forward in terms of relations between us and you. So I think that there's been a kind of agreement within the Russian leadership. On the one hand, we see that Putin himself wants to keep the door open to Trump. Others in the leadership, including Lavrov himself and other officials, even more outspokenly, people like Medvedev and Miroshnik, have been saying, well, if he does indeed decide to deploy the Tomahawks, then in that case, he cannot act as a mediator. We cannot continue to work with him any further. What the deal that has been agreed is that we will continue with the fiction for the moment that Trump is being led down the nose, by people like Kellogg and others. But if the Tomahawks are indeed deployed, then the Alaska process is indeed formally ended. And by the way, Lavrov had some things to say about Kellogg. He said that Kellogg has been making statements opposing any recognition for any territories by claiming that you may have de facto control of them and that it is all right. And again, he's made it clear, Lavrov made it clear, that for the Russians, that is simply not acceptable. Lavrov, incidentally, also said that the Russians have not suggested to the Americans any meeting to discuss the Tomahawks. The question was as follows, speaking about the Tomahawk cruise missiles, all the American plans to supply weapons under the previous administration, announced in official statements or through leaks to the media from the HIMARS system to the F-16s, have ultimately been implemented. Can Russia convince the current administration not to move forward with the supply of these long-range weapons? And Lavrov replied, we have not requested a meeting to convince the US administration that this would be an extremely dangerous move. We believe that they are smart and experienced people who are fully aware that this would move the situation to a fundamentally new level. So basically, what Lavrov is saying is we're not going to bother to discuss this with the Americans because they know what this means, or should know what this means by themselves. And, well, implicitly, he's also saying that we're not going to discuss this with the Americans because if we do discuss this with the Americans, we know that it is not going to make any difference. It might even harden the American determination to press forward with a supply of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine because the Americans might run away with the idea that we are scared of them. The simple fact and the position that all of us in Moscow are now agreed with is that if these missiles are deployed, then the Alaska process is ended. Well, this is, as I said, I think what the Russian leadership has decided that it is going to say. But I'm also going to say that I believe that there are many, many people in Moscow and in Russia who will still think that this is altogether too soft and who think that a more clear-cut warning to Trump, to the Americans at this point was needed. I repeat my view. I don't think that such a warning would have made any difference, but it might have calmed the mood in Moscow. If you read the Kommersant article, again, it's noticeable there how aggressive on the question of the Tomahawks, some of the questions that Kommersant put to Lavrov are, and, well, Lavrov's own efforts both to satisfy his interviewer, but also to remain loyal to Putin's position. Anyway, it's all now academic because I think this decision has now been made and I suspect that it is going to be announced today. I don't know how many missiles will be provided. I don't know when they are going to be provided. But going back to that article in the Financial Times, again, that article made the really remarkable admission that they're not going to make a difference. Are they a game changer? In short, no. The senior NATO official said the Tomahawks would complement what Ukraine has already been achieving with its long-range drone attacks. And a Ukrainian official, Zagorodnyuk, said no single system alone has been a game changer so far, but in combination they can make a big difference. Well, that's a Ukrainian, and I doubt it. Kang Kian, an ex-Pentagon official, said, agreed it was not the Tomahawk itself that would be a game changer, but if they were sent in waves at Russian targets, that might do a lot of damage to the Russian energy system, and maybe even airfields. But that's hardly likely for all kinds of reasons. And Townsend, another person consulted by the Financial Times, said any deal on the Tomahawks would be a kind of a cherry on top because it'll give Zelensky that long reach that's going to put a lot of pressure on Putin. Note, again, it's all about pressure. It's not about winning the war. And it's not going to put pressure on Putin in the sense that the Americans appear to believe it's not going to put pressure on Putin to make concessions. It's putting pressure on Putin to break the dialogue with the United States. And, well, the article, the interview that Lavrov has just given to Kommersant suggests strongly that Putin is gradually, grudgingly perhaps, coming round to acceding to that pressure. Now, Trump has also tried to put pressure on Putin to try to gain leverage in a completely different way. He had a telephone conversation with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And following that conversation, he made the claim that over the course of the conversation, Modi assured him that India is going to stop buying Russian oil. Now, shortly after Trump made that statement, and Trump accepted that it would take time before India stopped buying Russian oil, but he seemed to think that it wouldn't take very long. Anyway, shortly after that statement, both the Russians and the Indians effectively contradicted it. This is the statement that the official spokesman of the Indian Foreign Ministry has made in response to media queries on comments on India's energy sourcing. Now, notice how carefully this is expressed. I'm reading the title of the Indian spokesperson's response that appears in the Indian Foreign Ministry website. They are careful not to refer specifically to Donald Trump. They talked about comments on India's energy sourcing. In response to comments on India's energy sourcing, official spokesperson Sri Randhir Jaiswal said, India is a significant importer of oil and gas. It has been our consistent priority to safeguard the interests of the Indian consumer in a volatile energy scenario. Our import policies are guided entirely by this objective. Ensuring stable energy prices and secured supplies have been the twin goals of our energy policy. This includes broad-basing our energy sourcing and diversifying as appropriate to meet market conditions. Where the United States is concerned, we have for many years sought to expand our energy procurement. This has steadily progressed in the last decade. The current administration has shown interest in deepening energy cooperation with India. Discussions are ongoing. That is a polite way of saying Trump is wrong. Now, they don't want to inflame the relationship between India and the United States further. Modi has been trying over the last couple of weeks to calm tempers with the United States and with Donald Trump in particular. He has a particular reason for doing that, because in a few weeks' time, he's going to be hosting President Putin of Russia in India, and there will be significant agreements made to buy weapon systems, probably S-400 missiles, and quite possibly Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jets. And no doubt there will be further economic agreements as well. So the Indians don't want to say that Trump is wrong or that Trump is lying, but look at how carefully worded this statement is. India is a significant importer of oil and gas. It has been our consistent priority to safeguard the interests of the Indian consumer in a volatile energy scenario. Our import policies are guided entirely by this objective. Consistent priority. In other words, Indian oil purchasing policy has not changed. It was what it was before, and it continues to remain the same today. And our import policies are guided entirely by this objective, maintaining stable prices for oil and gas on the Indian consumer market. Ensuring stable energy prices and secured supplies have been the twin goals of our energy policy. This includes broad basing our energy sources and diversifying as appropriate to meet market conditions. So it is the situation in the oil and gas market that determines Indian buying policy. If India finds that the cheapest and most reliable supplier of oil and indeed gas continues to be Russia, then India will continue to buy oil and gas from Russia. And as far as the United States is concerned, well, we have sought for many years to expand our energy procurement. This has steadily progressed in the last decade, so nothing is changing. We're just continuing to develop our energy relationship with the United States, but this is a progressive approach. And the current administration, which is to say the Trump administration, wants to deepen energy cooperation with India, and we are willing to talk with them about that. That's all. So it's the Indians saying, well, what Trump is saying goes far beyond what Modi told him over the course of the call. Now, the Russians themselves have responded to these media inquiries. We've had statements from the Russian Energy Ministry, and they come directly from Russia's Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, who is in overall charge of Russian energy policy. He said this: we continue to cooperate with our friendly partners. Our energy resource is in demand. It is economically viable, reasonable, and I'm confident that our partners will continue to collaborate with us, interact, and develop energy cooperation. We only see signals in the media that India will allegedly stop buying Russian oil. Our partners emphasize that no one can dictate to them and they will choose their own path. So, in other words, the Russians have been in contact with the Indians and they have received reassurances that Trump might be saying all kinds of things, but the realities remain the same. And Peskov himself has reiterated this. He says, we rely on the official statements issued by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi, as well as a statement from Beijing. These statements are publicly available and we are guided by them. And he refers not just to the statement of the Indian press spokesman that I've just read, but also to statements by Li Qian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, who has accused the United States of taking steps to undermine global supply chains with demands that other countries stop buying Russian oil. By the way, Novak, over the course of his comments to the Russian media, essentially contradicting what Trump has been saying, Novak also said that it is indeed the case that some Indian oil buyers are now paying for Russian oil in Chinese currency. But mostly, India now buys Russian oil paying in rubles. Now, I am not sure how that works, given that Russia runs a trade surplus with India. Perhaps the Russians have been providing loans. Goodness knows. There may be all sorts of explanations and other things. Clearly, there's been a lot of financial engineering beneath the surface with this oil buying relationship. Now, to repeat again, the overall story of behind all of this is of the President of the United States, of Donald Trump, trying to gain leverage over the Russians, trying to force the Russians to go back to the plan that General Kellogg sold to him in April last year, and to which Trump himself always in the end seems to want to revert to. Every so often, he seems to show some understanding that the Russians are not going to accept the Kellogg plan. During the meeting in Alaska, he publicly accepted that Kellogg's proposal for a ceasefire before substantive negotiations take place is not going to be acceptable to the Russians and is not going to happen. But after a time, very much in the way that Lavrov says, the hardliners, Kellogg, and the Europeans start working on Trump again, and they eventually bring him back to what are basically Kellogg's ideas. And to repeat, this is what he said. They make no secret of their desire to lead Donald Trump astray from the righteous path, to divert him from the course he himself charted through his political instincts. They're exploiting Trump's temperamental preference for swift decisions, deliberately protracting this process. They seek to convince him that it is not Zelensky and Europe who are playing the fool, but rather our president, Vladimir Putin, who does not want peace. So the Russians are aware of this. They are clearly frustrated and angered by this. They don't, however, for the moment at least Putin for the moment, doesn't want to give up completely on what he thinks he agreed with Trump in Anchorage. The others in Moscow are saying to Putin, okay, look, we've heard this. We understand that the Tomahawk missile thing is now a done thing. But if it does indeed play out like that, this is where the red line must be in terms of our relations with Trump. After this point, the dialogue with him must stop. To reiterate again, Trump may think he is gaining leverage over the Russians. The reality is that he isn't. Now, here I'm going to say something about Donald Trump, and I've said it previously. I think that Trump functions inside a bubble. He doesn't read intelligence estimates or reports. He doesn't call in experts from the wider community of experts, which in the United States is enormous. Ray McGovern has just emailed me and has pointed out the whole succession of memos that Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPs, have been publishing since before the conflict in Ukraine began. And if you go through all of these memos, they are, as always with VIPs, full of prescience as well as insight. Trump, as President of the United States, could call these people in and he could speak with them and he would get an alternative view. He could speak to others. He could speak to major foreign policy experts, people like Professor Mearsheimer and Professor Sachs, who've been privileged to speak to in the Duran. If he doesn't want to talk to them, he can find others. Jennifer Kavanagh, who writes for Responsible Statecraft. Indeed, the entire team at Responsible Statecraft. They are all there. They're ready to speak to the people at the American Conservative, all sorts of people, and many, many others whom I don't know. People within the military, people within former intelligence officers who are not associated with VIPs, but who have had history of dealing with the Russians. Former officials, people like Chas Freeman and Ambassador Matlock. People like them. He could talk to all of these. He could talk to people from the economics world, from the world of business and industry. That is the prerogative, I would argue, the duty of the president. President Kennedy, when he was president all the way back in the 60s, he went out of his way to do that. he understood and was very, very suspicious of the kind of briefings and information he was getting from the embryonic blob, which is what Barack Obama once called the foreign policy establishment in Washington, that always predictably give the same belligerent advice on every issue, can be relied upon to give the same belligerent advice to every official, through every official and through every channel to the president. Well, Donald Trump doesn't do that. He doesn't, as I said, read reports. He doesn't discuss things more widely. Apparently he rolls his eyes when Putin comes along and tries to explain things to him. I discussed recently in one of my programs how Trump seemed bewildered that a meeting between Putin and Witkoff might continue for 5 hours. He doesn't seem to have grasped that the fact that a busy man like Putin is prepared to give 5 hours to a discussion with Witkoff suggests that for Putin, the president of Russia, this is an extremely important issue. And, well, he needs, if he's going to make any headway, whether it be with the Russians or, by the way, with the Chinese, whom I'm going to come to shortly, he needs to start to do that. Now, it's been pointed out to me that recently Trump has reverted to getting advice from his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who I know provokes very strong feelings from all sorts of people. Well, I'm going to say this. I've heard a number of things about Kushner, and it does seem that he is indeed somebody who at least listens. And perhaps it might make more sense, especially given that Kushner is Trump's son-in-law, if Kushner was sent to Moscow to meet with Putin, then perhaps Witkoff, who the entire political class and foreign policy establishment in Washington has worked against, because Kushner, after all, as the son-in-law of the president, has a position from which he cannot be sacked. I merely make that point. Perhaps others will disagree. But one way or the other, to reiterate again, I think that since he became president, Trump continues to make the wrong decisions, consistently the wrong decisions, in part because he consistently gets the wrong advice. He doesn't search out the advice. He doesn't read widely. He doesn't listen widely. He doesn't listen very much or attentively to what the Russians are telling him. He doesn't listen widely or attentively to what the Chinese are telling him. He prefers to go with all of the people that there are in Washington. All of them, of course, have an agenda which ultimately is going to drive him deeper and further into the war. Notice again Lavrov's point that Trump says that he doesn't want to escalate the war, and yet seems oblivious to the fact that supplying Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles is itself a major act of escalation. Notice again how he has misrepresented, of this I have no doubt, a conversation he has just had with the Prime Minister of India, seemingly oblivious to the damage this is inevitably going to cause with his relationship with the Prime Minister of India and with the Indian government. Modi is going to be even more careful talking to Trump from this point on than he has been previously. Just so. Anyway, there we are. That is the state of things today. To go back to what Lavrov has been saying, it is clear that everything has come to a complete stop. There is no movement on anything. Lavrov had this to say about Alaska. I would not call it a breakthrough. It was a lengthy conversation aimed at mutual understanding. And the Russians explain things. We have always insisted it is not merely the conflict in Ukraine is not merely about land, but about the people who have lived on that land for centuries. He goes on to say that the Russians have made huge efforts to have discussions with the Americans, but as he put it, all of the initiatives that were taken by the Russians, both at Alaska and thereafter, initiatives to upgrade the talks in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine, various proposals, they have all come to nothing. And Trump, as he put it, said he needed to consult with Washington. And we are waiting their response. And of course, as Conversant pointed out, well, you've got his response. He's sending Ukraine Tomahawk missiles. And so the Russians are edging themselves towards accepting, even Putin is edging towards accepting that Alaska has been, in the end, proved in the end to be a dead end. So that leaves us with the war. And I've discussed the war in very great detail, of course, in recent programs. But the war, of course, goes on. And we've heard further news over the course of the last 24 hours. And, well, the most dramatic news, as far as I can see, appears to be coming from three areas. From Pokrovsk, first of all, where the Russians claim that they captured a village called Novopavlovka, which is located to the southeast of Pokrovsk. I believe that the Russians have actually been in control of Novopavlovka for some time, for several weeks in fact. They probably only announced it now because the Russians quite often delay announcements of the capture of territory, either until that territory is fully consolidated, control of that territory is fully consolidated, or until the point is reached when they can build further momentum on the strength of their capture of the territory in question. And I think that in this case, it is the latter the reason. They've captured Novopavlovka. Novopavlovka lies somewhere to the southwest of Mirnograd, close to the southwest of Mirnograd. The Russians have entered Mirnograd. There is fighting going on there. There's been more reports that the Russians are successfully pushing the Ukrainians back in Mirnograd. There's been more reports that the Russians have been increasingly successful in other parts of the front lines as well, around Pokrovsk. The circle around Pokrovsk, in other words, continues to tighten, and it continues to tighten all the time. Now, the other interesting development is that on the Zaporozhye front, the Russians have apparently started to drop leaflets on Ukrainian troops in the important village of Veliko Mikhailovka and in other villages, smaller villages around this village, telling them to lay down their arms. It looks as if a Russian attack on Veliko Mikhailovka is coming. I suspect that the maps in this area are out of date. The maps do not show the real situation around Veliko Mikhailovka. I suspect that the Russians are well to the west of this village. It is likely that it is going to be stormed. And as I pointed out several times, Veliko Mikhailovka is well inside the map I am using that shows the city of Zaporozhye. In fact, the Russian offensive towards Zaporozhye from the east is continuing remorselessly. There is still heavy fighting further south in the villages of Poltavka and Uspenivka, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold back the Russians. There's a river that passes through these villages. The Russians have captured all the territory east of the river. There are reports that they have a bridgehead west of the river, that these have been contradicted by some people. I don't know what the truth is. As I said, I'm not there. But anyway, the fact is that even as the Ukrainians are trying to hold back the Russians in these two southern villages of Poltavka and Uspenivka, the Russians appear to be about to storm the village, the other important village further to the north, which is Veliko Mikhailovka. And again, we see the Ukrainians having to move forces backwards and forwards from one place to another. There are also reports that the Russians have almost completed the capture of the village of Dronovka, west of Siversk, and that they're in the process also, that they now control most of Yampol, which is to the rest of Dronovka. In other words, the noose around Siversk is tightening as well. And of course, Marochko and Pushilin have said that there is fighting going on inside Siversk itself, and that there is also fighting going on inside Konstantinovka. So the battles continue. Perhaps the single most shocking piece of information actually did not come from any of these places that I've just been talking about, but came from the Kupiansk area. The Russians, as far as I can see, now control pretty much the entirety of Kupiansk, west of the Oskol River. And this is the part of Kupiansk, by the way, which is on high ground. And that has left Ukrainian forces that were located east of the Oskol River essentially trapped. They are on the east bank, the Russian-controlled east bank of the Oskol River. They're surrounded on all sides by the Russians. They have the Oskol River at their back, and the Russians control Kupiansk, which means that they control most of the West Bank. And they also, of course, the Russians are also operating drones above the Oskol River itself, making the movement of supplies to the Ukrainian troops east of the Oskol River and withdrawal by the Ukrainian troops across the Oskol River to the west exceptionally difficult, perhaps even impossible. Anyway, there were reports yesterday, and they come from Russian sources, and obviously I can't confirm them, that the Russians have captured various positions that the Ukrainian troops had in this area east of the Oskol River, that the Ukrainians put up hardly any resistance, that they were cold and hungry and out of ammunition and supplies, that, in other words, the Ukrainian force located east of the Oskol River is being squeezed to the point that its ability to continue to resist the Russians is collapsing. Well, that was a Russian report. It may be that the realities are different or more complicated, But looking at the maps, I can believe it is true. Anyway, that's the situation in the conflict in Ukraine. The West, the Americans themselves, seem to understand that supplying Tomahawk missiles is not going to change the calculus of the war. The supply of Patriot missiles to Ukraine did not secure Ukraine's position in the sky. The Ukrainians have conclusively lost the war in the sky. The Americans, because they realize this, are now trying to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, thinking that these missiles will somehow alter the balance or at least alter the Russian calculus. The Russians have made it clear that, firstly, it is not going to change the military realities. That has been confirmed by Western military analysts. It's not going to change Russian policy or Russian actions. What it is going to do is to wreck Trump's attempts to set himself up as a mediator in this conflict, something which many, many people in Russia and indeed in the West always thought was bizarre anyway, given that Trump is the president of the United States, which has been facilitating Ukraine's conduct of this conflict. So anyway, we will see what happens. I'm confident that the Tomahawks will be provided. I don't believe the Indians are going to stop buying Russian oil. I think the statements by the Indians and the Russians today make that fairly clear. In fact, make it crystal clear. The Chinese, of course, are furious with the Americans for all sorts of reasons, as we'll come to in a moment. And one way or the other, the conflict in Ukraine is going to continue, and we're going to end up back where we were in 2024, when really the only question was the war and the developments in the war. Negotiations essentially had been attempted and had come to a complete stop. And to reiterate again, that is how some people in Russia want it. They do not want negotiations. They do not want a diplomatic compromise. They want to see the defeat of Ukraine, and they have regarded this entire process of discussion between Trump and Putin over the last 8 months with deep suspicion. Now, in the meantime, President Trump continues his economic trade war with China. And again, the rhetoric from the United States has been extraordinary. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has said that China is going down and seems to be determined to pull everybody else down with it. China is in recession or depression or something of that kind. This is absurd claims. I know that they are made all the time, that people have been making these claims every day. You will find them in certain American and other media outlets. The reality is the Chinese economy has been growing, and its foreign trade surplus, its exports have been increasing, despite all of the efforts that Trump has been making over the last year to slow them down. So, again, the Americans may be saying these sort of things to each other, but that is the reality. In fact, I would go further. When Bessent says that the Chinese seem to be intent to pull everybody down with them, is that not an admission that what the Chinese are doing, what the Chinese announced last week, is indeed going to affect economics, the economic position of the United States and of its allies, and do so in a very serious way. Well, let's first of all understand what the Chinese have done and why it is important. Now, there's been a lot of reporting in the media that the Chinese have banned exports of rare earths. This is not, in fact, so. It's been explained to me now carefully by several people in China, and one of those people, I will say straight away, has been Sofia Midkiff, small town voice. But anyway, I've verified this, and this is what the Chinese have been doing. Ever since the trade war first began in April, the Chinese have been developing tracking systems to monitor and understand where their rare earth exports were going. So if rare earths were being supplied to, say, a company in Argentina, the Chinese now know if that company in Argentina re-exports those rare earths, for example, to the United States. China previously did not have that ability. Now it does. It's been able to set up careful monitoring systems, presumably using open record information, and they have that information. And they then announced last week that they're going to tighten up licenses, and that from this point on, people who want to buy rare earths from China, companies, businesses, countries, they will have to agree licenses with China, which will restrict end use of rare earths that China exports to them. In other words, the Chinese will be able to stop exports of rare earths or re-exports of rare earths to customers that they might disapprove of. For example, the U.S. defense industry, which is a user of rare earths. Apparently, or allegedly, it is impossible to make certain equipment, F-35s and such things, without having some rare earth minerals to complete the process. Now, there is another factor here at play here, which is that rare earths apparently are also used to make the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that the Dutch produce, and of which the Dutch have an effective and exclusive monopoly. And these machines, even when they are produced, obviously they need to be repaired from time to time. And besides, apparently, as part of the chip making process, they need rare earths as well. I don't know whether the chips themselves have to have rare earths. I have no knowledge of these matters, and I'm not going to get into a discussion of it because I'm not able to discuss this. Anyway, the point is that, as it has been pointed out to me, American chip makers are really mostly designers. NVIDIA, for example, designs chips, but chips, especially the very advanced chips, are made in Taiwan or by the Taiwanese company using the Dutch lithography machines. If rare earth exports stop, then that process becomes impossible using existing technologies. Now, again, I've had explanations about the importance of rare earths in the production chain, and these come from people who are not just Chinese. Briefly, the difficulty is not just refining rare earths, but refining rare earths to the kind of extreme levels that the Chinese do. And the Chinese have a essential monopoly on this at the extreme levels. So, for example, it might be possible to refine rare earths up to 99.9% purity, but the real challenge is to refine them further to say 99.998% purity. And for the moment, that is something that only the Chinese can do. And the Chinese worked on developing this purification process. They initiated the first studies on how to do that way back in the 1960s, some say the 1970s. They have been working on this consistently ever since, and this is an enormously complex process. It is one that might differ depending on the rare earths in question. It is not one that can be quickly duplicated or easily understood. And this is perhaps the further problem, that the theory, the concept behind obtaining these very pure quantities of rare earths is not well understood outside China. This contrasts, for example, with the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. The Chinese might not be able to make them for the moment because they can't produce all of the pieces of these very complex machines up to the necessary tolerances. But they understand the theory of how to do it very well. And over time, no doubt they will be able to replicate all of the production processes themselves to make these machines. So the point is this: China, if it chooses to stop exports of rare earths or to block exports of rare earths to particular customers, now has the power to do it. And there is really no alternative to China in terms of rare earths. Obviously, in time, if people really worked on this, they would be able to get there, but it would take time, probably a lot of time. And in the meantime, the Chinese, of course, will have developed their lithography machines, and they will have moved forward in all the various different spheres of technology, as will their friends like the Russians, who, of course, will have no restrictions on purchases from China of rare earths. Just saying. So, that is where we are. Now, what apparently drove the Chinese to do this was indeed the salami tactics that the United States has been applying against Chinese trade in goods since the ceasefire, the trade ceasefire, that had appeared to have been agreed back in Madrid in September. And here I'm going to make a guess. I think there were three things that really infuriated the Chinese. Firstly, and I've discussed this already, the decision to impose fees on ships that dock in American ports that have been built in China, irrespective of whether they are operated by Chinese companies. That was an outrageous act, but it was one that the United States chose to make, a direct attack on China's shipbuilding industry. The second was the Dutch seizure of a semiconductor company in the Netherlands. Again, it's difficult to understand what the precise motivation behind this was, because as far as I can understand, this company was not involved in really high-end technical work with semiconductors. But anyway, what basically happened is that the Dutch authorities have apparently stepped in, sacked the entire management team, appointed their own, and they are pretending that the company nonetheless continues to be under Chinese ownership, even though it is officials of the Dutch government who now manage it. I've discussed many times in programs that I have done about seizing Russian assets that coming up with schemes to conceal the fact that you are essentially seizing or confiscating someone else's assets does not strengthen your legal position. It merely exposes the fact that you know that what you are doing is wrong. This overcomplicated scheme to gain control of this Chinese-owned semiconductor company is a case in point. Simply telling the Chinese we're not really seizing this company, we're just changing its management, is ridiculous. And the Chinese have been infuriated about it. And apparently there are threats in China to retaliate against the very, very big investments that Dutch companies have made in China, and to place restrictions on Dutch trading with China from this point going forward. But anyway, the key thing is that this incident infuriated the Chinese. The other was the American decision to block Chinese airlines flying passengers to and from the United States from crossing Russian airspace. Presumably, this was done in order to create trouble between China and Russia. In the event, it did the opposite, and it infuriated the Chinese. And I have been told that it was the single decision, more than any other, that provoked the Chinese to take this step that they are taking now with rare earths. Anyway, the United States, of course, had a way out of this problem. They've complained about the fact that Chinese airlines have a competitive advantage over the United States because they can cross Russian airspace. The Chinese say, what has that got to do with us? It is you who took the decision to stop your airlines crossing Russian airspace. The Russians, as I've discussed in many programs, have been trying to get the Americans to agree to lift the restrictions and to resume direct air links. We see that the Americans have done the opposite, and we see the result from China. Anyway, there it is. Now, Trump was upset and infuriated and alarmed when the Chinese did what they did. He's since tried to make up with the Chinese. He still wants to meet Xi Jinping in the APEC summit in South Korea. It's the usual game with him. Blow hot, blow cold, throw a tantrum, then grovel. The result, however, the response from China has been a stony silence. At some point, I presume that Bassett or some other American official will meet with some Chinese official. But I am increasingly getting the sense that the Chinese have had enough, and that this is indeed the moment when they say enough is enough. This is one tool that we have, restrictions on exports of rare earths, and we are going to use it. Now, I'm going to finish this program by making one very simple point. The United States is furious because China is doing to the United States what the United States does to other countries all the time. The United States imposes sanctions continuously, pretty much every day. Every day If you go to the State Department or Treasury websites, you will find about more sanctions that the United States is imposing against someone somewhere. The United States has, for as long as I can remember, operated restrictions forbidding the re-export of goods or technology that it produces to third parties that it disapproves of. So if you buy high-end chips from the United States, you're not supposed to sell them to Russia, for example. And there are American rules, very elaborate American rules about that. There have been, by the way, since the Cold War. Way back in the Cold War, in the 1950s, the United States and its European allies created the so-called COCOM restrictions, preventing what were supposedly dual exports of dual-use technology to the Soviet Union and its allies. And by the way, my understanding is that at no point since the end of the Cold War have the COCOM restrictions in trade with Russia ever been relaxed. Just saying. So the United States does this all the time. The United States prohibits use of the dollar with banks, financial institutions, companies that it disapproves of. And it has means to track movements of dollars around the world. And if it discovers that one bank is trading in dollars with, again, let's say a bank in Iran, then it can take action. And it reserves the right to take action against the bank that does that. The whole elaborate structure of secondary sanctions created by the United States, basically since the 1990s, hinges on this principle. So this extraordinary explosion of petulance, this furious rage at China, because China is now basically copying what the United States has for a very long time been doing, is a classic case study of the United States finding it outrageous and unacceptable that others might do unto it what it always, repeatedly, continuously, every day does to pretty much everyone else. Of course, for some Americans, making those kind of comparisons is offensive. One will always be accused of, well, whataboutism and all of that. But, of course, if you're in Beijing or Moscow or Tehran, or, by the way, in Africa or Latin America, you could see this immediately. Now, more and more countries gradually are going to start to do this. They're going to start pulling out of dollars. They're going to start conducting their trade in all kinds of ways. They will not want to get into direct conflict with the United States. We see this with Modi and Trump. Probably Modi, who's been trying, as I said, to improve relations with the United States. He had a meeting with the new U.S. ambassador. He's spoken to President Trump several times. He's trying to calm tensions with the United States. He says soothing words to him. But again, having his words misrepresented is going to make him even more determined than he probably already was, to start thinking about how to get round this problem of the United States. And the United States is going to have to start to get used to this, because more and more countries are going to do this. The Chinese are, for example, going to buy soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, and are going to start growing soybeans themselves. Trump was furious because the Chinese are doing that. But Of course the Chinese will do it. And of course the Argentinians and the Brazilians will sell soybeans to China if the United States is reckless enough to start imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, so that the Chinese impose reciprocal tariffs on the United States and continues to impose sanctions on the United States. And no one has done it as dramatically as the Chinese have done. But I do not believe that the Chinese, having created these structures with rare earths, are going to drop them or are going to agree to waive them. This is the tool, the leverage they have over the United States from this point on going forward. And the United States will have to get used to a world where it is not just the United States that has leverage over others, but others who also have leverage over the United States. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you like this video and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.